ICMA.org/EMO.
Welcome, everyone. The ICMA Learning Lab is pleased to present this online education program, Beyond the Data, Charting a Path to Economic Opportunity Through Storytelling, brought to you by the Mid-America Regional Council and the ICMA Research and Policy Team. Today's presentation will last up to 90 minutes and includes question and answer opportunities, so please submit your questions at any time throughout the presentation using the Q&A panel at the bottom of the screen. During Q&A, our presenters will answer as many questions as time allows. It is my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Anna Mitchell, Senior Program Manager for Publications and Research. Anna, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Julian. And thank you all for joining us, and welcome to Beyond the Data, Charting a Path to Economic Opportunity Through Storytelling. This session is part of a series of learning and training opportunities in 2023 that focus on boosting upward mobility in local communities. With the support of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's Economic Mobility and Opportunity Program and embedded within ICMA's Local Government Reimagined initiative, local leaders will learn about drivers that work to move the needle for the security, health, and welfare of vulnerable residents and communities across the country. In addition to training opportunities, part of this work has been with our Economic Mobility and Opportunity cohort, which you learned a bit about in the video that was played right before this session. The cohort is a group of 10 communities that have been selected to be part of the peer learning cohort while undertaking an EMO-centered project within their own communities. Providing this session is one of the many suggestions that has come from their discussions. We understand that some of you came for training on data and some came for training on economic mobility. Hopefully by the end of this session, you can learn a bit more about both. Today, our session will be presented by Amanda Graor, the Chief Innovation Officer and Deputy Director of Research Services at the Mid-America Regional Council in Kansas City. Amanda is responsible for increasing MARC's capacity to advance regional goals and collaborative initiatives through innovation in public policy and process improvement, including strategic development of data and technology. She has been with MARC for more than 15 years, with work in areas over time, including air quality, workforce transportation, energy policy, and climate strategy. Amanda also spent time as an economic mobility policy fellow with the Center for Applied Public Research at Johns Hopkins University. She holds a bachelor's degree in Earth System Science and Engineering from the University of Michigan, a master's degree in Public Administration from the University of Kansas, and a certificate in Data Visualization from Parsons School of Design. During the session, we do have the chat feature and the Q&A feature active for the webinar, so please feel free to use those to submit any questions you may have. We will have a portion of our time at the end for Q&A as well. Thank you for joining us, and I will hand it off to Amanda.
Great, thank you, Anna. And yes, I actively encourage questions as we go along during this. And so please do, and I'll try to keep an eye on it while we're going to see if I can answer some midstream, but we will certainly leave time at the end for any kind of questions that you guys have. So last week we talked mostly about data visualization, and this week we're focusing on data storytelling. And so our objectives for today are just what is data storytelling? What do we mean by data storytelling? Then we're going to go into some elements of storytelling, and then we're going to talk about recognizing and acknowledging bias in data. And that third part is especially important just because as we're talking about economic mobility data in particular, we're talking about people's life situations, we're talking about a lot of demographic data and things as it relates to their income and their generational abilities and all kinds of things that are very personal for people. And so we need to make sure that we're recognizing and acknowledging the bias that comes with a lot of data that maybe even that has been historically used for that purpose, but that we'll spend some time at the end of the webinar talking about that and then take questions and answers at the end. So we're starting with what is data storytelling? And there are so many resources online and there are so many good books on this. And you'll notice in these slides, there's links to where the source material for all of this. And I actively encourage you to go and explore these resources and find out more information about them because there is so much good information out there. But we're starting with a writing from the Harvard Business School. What is data storytelling? And so this, how to effectively tell a story with data, defines data storytelling as the ability to effectively communicate insights from a data set. So that the data set is really that underlying element of the story, using narratives and visualizations. And so again, we focused on visualizations last week, and this week we're focusing more on those narratives. So what can it be used for? It can be used to put data insights into context for and inspire action from your audience. So we're going to talk about that context setting, and we're going to talk about making sure we're talking to the audience that's in front of us. So what are the key components of data storytelling? We've got the data, the narrative, and the visualization. And so the data is that analysis of accurate and complete data that's serving as the foundation of your data story. And there can be multiple kinds of data analysis, but that can really enable you to understand the full picture and tell the full story of what you're trying to tell. The narrative is either verbal or written. It doesn't always have to be written. It doesn't always have to be, sometimes it's just spoken out loud alongside your data, but that's what you're using to communicate the insights gleaned from the data and that context surrounding it. So, and also what actions you recommend for people. When you're telling a story with data, you need to have an end goal in mind. What are you inspiring your audience to do with it? Because otherwise you're just showing them data and they think to themselves, huh, that's neat. And they don't take anything from it. They move on from it and they'll forget it as they're walking out the door. So what are you really asking for people to take with them from your story? And then what are you asking them to do with it after the fact? And then you have those visualizations that are the data part of your story. So they represent your data, they help support your narrative, and they're useful for communicating the story clearly and memorably. So what are the elements of storytelling at a base level? Storytelling is, centuries, generations, storytelling is a practice that supersedes all of what we're talking about right now. People learn through stories, people understand through passing information down through generations. Storytelling at its core is how we pass information on to one another. So at a base level, there's a book called Introductions to Data Visualization and Storytelling that is a fantastic, easy reading book that has a lot of really good resources if you're trying to lead a team through data visualization and storytelling. And so the quote, the section that talks about what storytelling really is in this book about data visualization and storytelling says, to understand what a narrative is, we first need to understand what a story is. And a story is an account of events. We humans love stories. And why is that? Telling and consuming stories is addictive. For example, listening to an Aesop fable, reading a book, and watching a movie, all of those release oxytocin in the brain, the feel-good hormone. So from an anthropological perspective, during most of our childhoods, narratives are used to shape children on proper behavior and values, and this is usually done through tales. We think about children's books, storybooks, that they're helping children understand how to act growing up. And the storytelling that we're doing as adults with data visualization and data storytelling is really helping people understand what we want the outcome of that story to be. If we go all the way backwards to a basic level, storytelling, and this is from the National Storytelling Network, so they're not talking specifically about data storytelling here, but ultimately, storytelling is the interactive art of using words and actions to reveal the elements and images of a story while encouraging the listener's imagination. So we're telling people something and we're asking them to take it to the next step. And data is obviously one of the underlying pieces of data storytelling. Without data, there is no storytelling. And so we've got definitions, like straight up definitions of data from the dictionary. These are 4 different dictionary definitions of data. From all of them, it includes the word information, factual information, facts or information, facts or figures, information, especially facts or numbers. So they're fairly consistent across all of them on what data is. But if you notice in these definitions, it goes on to say, used as a basis for reasoning, discussion, or calculation, used to find out things or to make decisions, from which conclusions can be inferred, or information, used in help decision making. So even the dictionary definitions of data isn't helpful on its own. It's used to make decisions, to inform decisions as a basis for reasoning. And what better form to put them in than a story to help people understand the data better, understand why it's important, understand then what next with the data. So ultimately, what is data storytelling? You combine the storytelling elements with what data really is. Some of you may have seen this chart before. I got this version of it from effectivedatastorytelling.com, which is another fantastic resource. There's a book that goes along with this particular information. But there are elements to build up to a story with data storytelling. So you start with the data collection. You gather data on something to measure or to understand its performance or its behavior. You need that to collect the data first. Then you prepare it, you cleanse it, you organize it, combine it into appropriate buckets so it's ready to be analyzed. You take it the next step and you visualize the data so people can more easily monitor, understand what's happening, identify those trends, understand what the story really is. Then you go into the analysis site, and that's where you get the insights that start mattering to a specific audience. So we'll talk a few more times about audience in this, but what's really important is understanding who is the audience for your story. The exact same data set could mean different things to different people. You talk something as simple as an age range. The age range of 14 to 18 might be specifically important to a certain audience that's looking to promote young adult novels or talk about college scholarships, whereas the information about a cohort of 60 and older might be particularly interesting to an area agency on aging. Or, the same data set can be useful to so many different audiences, but knowing who your audience is and why they need those insights from it will help develop your story more so than just saying, well, we have this data story or we have this data set and it's an age range. And then finally, you get to that data storytelling. You explain those insights with a narrative and with visuals so they resonate and inspire change, they inspire action, but being clear with what that change is that you're trying to inspire or influence is where we start really getting into the storytelling piece. So there's a series of books. There's a sort of set of heavy hitters kind of in that data storytelling and data visualization realm. You might hear their names a lot: Alberto Cairo and Cole Knaflic and Jonathan Schwabish. And so Cole Knaflic's series, The Storytelling with Data, she's got several books out, and there's a website that has a community around it, a fantastic resource for these kinds of things. So from her Storytelling with Data, we're going to source a lot of the content in this section from that particular book. But in her estimation, there's 6 important elements to data storytelling. First, we're trying to understand the context. Then we're choosing an appropriate visual display. We're eliminating clutter, and we'll go over each one of these as we step through these next couple slides. Focusing attention where you want it, thinking like a designer, and then telling a story. And ultimately, you notice telling a story is the last bullet point on there. That's because you have to develop all of these things before you really understand what the story is that you're trying to tell. If you go into a situation wanting to use data to prove something that you already believe, you can end up tending towards some confirmation bias, which we'll get into at the end when we talk a little bit more about bias. But making sure you have all of these elements in place before you start really developing that story or what you're trying to tell with it is really important to making sure you're telling something that the data actually says and not what it doesn't say. So first things first, setting the context. So before you start anything, before you start developing that data story that you're trying to tell, we should know who we're communicating to. We should talk about what we want our audience to know or do and how we can use the data to help make our point. And so to whom we are communicating. Who is your audience? Is it a city council? Is it a neighborhood association? Is it a group of folks that are working with your full employment council or a workforce program? Is it nonprofits? All of them have a different interest in what you're talking about. So making it relevant to them, I know it can be really tempting to make sort of one slide deck on a presentation and give that same presentation to multiple audiences. But realistically, understanding who you're talking to is a really important element of telling a story that's meaningful and that will land to them. Second, what do we want our audience to know or do? So again, what do we want them to come away from the story with? What if you just tell them everything? If you throw a bunch of charts up, if you make a dashboard that has a chart and a map for every possible piece of data and information that you have, they're not going to know any of it. And so making sure we are specific about what we want our audience to know and what we want them to do from it. We could show a chart that has greenhouse gas emissions from a certain period of time and going up or down. Okay, so now what? What are you asking them to do with that information? And how can we use the data to help make our point? So especially when we start talking about economic mobility data, there's transportation data, there's demographic data, there's workforce data, there's gender and ethnicity data and race data, and all of these different types of data sets that come together to tell stories on economic mobility, whether it's financial insecurity, whether it's transportation barriers, all of these different data sets are used together to tell a story. And anecdotal stories go a long way telling individual situations. You see that often in marketing campaigns where you have a persona or a real person that, this person needs these services and this is how it changed their life, which is also an important piece of that. But understanding how we're using entire data sets to help make our point when we're talking to decision makers and policymakers on what really comes next, that's a really important element for how we can use the data to help make our point. So then we talk about what type of visualization tells the story best. And these could be types of charts and graphs. It could be a narrative that tells the story best or a blog post. When you reduce to a single number, think about what context might be lost by doing so when you're reducing to a single chart or a single graph. So this is the next couple examples are how these graphs and charts tell a story that perhaps we're not trying to tell. So these are sourced, there's lots of examples out there, but these are sort of generalized examples. So I'm not calling any particular organization to the carpet on this. These are generalized examples, but from a post talking about 5 ways to lie with charts. And so you often see these kinds of charts, 3D tilted pie charts in a graphic. But it's the exact same data used in both of these charts. And on the left side, you would have the viewer underestimate labor costs. And on the right side, you might have the viewer overestimate labor costs. And it's all a perspective issue. So both of these pie charts show that labor takes up 30% of sum total, but the chart on the right makes it look a lot bigger by positioning it in the foreground and a thick 3D edge and more than double the number of dark pixels than when it's in the background. So something to be really cognizant of is human vision is not very good at interpreting the third dimension on charts and graphs. And so when we see a 3D chart, and I know sometimes they seem more designed or more cool than non-3D charts, but we assume that more color indicates a greater amount. You start talking about volume with 3D. And so when more pixels are used to represent a slice of pie, that slice appears to be more significant. So people assign greater value to the foreground slices than the background slices in 3D pie charts. So what is this story that you're trying to tell with these charts? And is it obfuscated by using a chart type that actually confuses the viewer? This is another example. Again, we can be really tempted by the things that Excel has in its back pocket on, oh, make this 3D or tilt this. But so for example, on the left chart, you can see the titles. One is that administration takes 27% of each dollar. On the right, it's administration expenses are minimal. And so clearly there's a story that's being told with this data. And one is to tell people that administration is taking too much of every dollar, and one is to say that administration expenses are actually not very much. But on the left graph, the axis label goes over 100%, which I wish I could figure out how to do this, but it turns out you cannot spend more than 100% of a dollar. And on the right side, it creates a visual illusion of relative weight of percentages because of the way it's shaped. So the top of the cone is technically over 1/4 of the value, but not near 1/4 of the volume of the cone. And so basically, we're introducing sort of irrelevant information. On the chart on the right, the only relevant property is the cone height. But even though the volume is irrelevant in the story that they're trying to tell, it's difficult to ignore. So we're assigning, again, greater value to the larger part of the cone. And the data, again, is the same in both of these charts. But if you're asking people to just judge height and ignore other things, the perception of the chart, your brain just takes that volume into consideration when you're looking at it. And then just sort of a last example, this says orders per salesperson for a group, but you could liken this to survey results on anything on a scale you could liken it to. So the left graph, you would think things are pretty consistent. Things are not changing a lot. There's not a significant variation from month to month. But on the right graph, it looks like there's wild fluctuations from month to month. And if you look at that, it's because of the scale on the left-hand side. And so the scale on the left chart starts at 0. The one on the right starts at the lowest data point. And so the axes labels play a big role in this. It looks like the orders per salesperson on the right one are just going off the charts. And that's just because of how the chart is made. And so the trick is it works because it's difficult for us to examine the chart scale and the data at the same time. So instead we get the gist of the curve first, and then we look at the scale. But by that point, our first impression has already been made. So when you're telling the story, if you're distracting from the story with the visual that you made, your story is not as compelling, or it might be misleading. It might not be the story that you're trying to tell because the visualizations that you've put along with it are leading the viewer to think or feel something differently about it. So then we talk about eliminating clutter, and clutter is just visual distraction that starts getting people to either not understand the data as well or focus on something different. And so these are just some high level options to start being more clear about what the data actually says. And so these might feel uncomfortable, but in some cases, removing the grid lines and the markers entirely actually tell a clearer story, and cleaning up those axis labels. And so as we move into the storytelling part of this, labeling the data directly and using annotations will go really far in helping tell the story that you're trying to tell. You're pointing out specific points in time on a line chart, you're pointing out specific pieces of that information, and the learner will then understand, okay, the story that I am to get from this information is that this particular point is important because it's an outlier, or this entire line is important because you can see over time there's not a lot of change in it, which could be good or bad. Maybe you've instituted a particular program to help reduce evictions, or maybe you've instituted a program to increase transportation access to certain things, and you notice that over time, you can't even see on that timeline when it happened because it's not making a difference. And that's an important piece of information to understand. Leveraging consistent color is a really interesting one. I know sometimes we like to put color all over the place, but making sure the color is consistent across chart types so people can mentally put things together is also a really important piece of telling the overall story. So then we start talking about focusing attention. And focusing attention is one piece of data storytelling that when you're telling a story, you want to hold people's attention. Now, the long-term memory, if we talk about that, it is where things that we memorize or remember are stored. And the iconic and working memories are the ones that are there where we interact with visualizations. So we're going to look more at iconic and working memories. And iconic memory, which is also kind of sensory memory, and is when we see a visual, that information remains in the iconic memory for a short period of time, and we process and store the information automatically in this kind of fraction of a second. And that is called pre-attentive processing. This happens automatically even before we think we're paying attention to something. And that pre-attentive process detects several visual attributes. And so when we talk about the visualizations as helping us tell the story, we need to understand how a particular attribute can stand out, and that can help us create visuals that emphasize the more important information. So again, when we're talking about use of color, sometimes, if you've got a line chart maybe that has 6 different colors because you're talking about different things. If there's only one line that you want people to be paying attention to, maybe gray out all of those other lines, leave them on the chart, but only make the one that you're talking about a certain color. So people can see where it trends compared to the other things that you're charting, but their attention is also on the one line that is the most important piece to your story. When we talk about working memory, or that's short-term memory, and this is what we use when we're actually working with a visual. And so the sensory information there is processed in the working memory, and it stays there for a little bit of time, but the capacity can be increased by chunking things together, which data visualizations often take advantage of. And this is where showing meaningful patterns, showing meaningful categorizations. So when we're looking at a visual, we can process more information that way than if it's kind of all over the place. And so for a visual to be effective, we have to pay attention not to providing as much information as possible, but really shaping the narrative and shaping the story so we can help people understand what that story really is. And then the sort of fifth bullet point, think like a designer. There are two specific strategies related to accessibility and communicating data. Don't overcomplicate it, and text is actually your friend sometimes. And so highlight the important stuff, eliminate the distractions, and create the clear hierarchy of information, but also avoid overcomplicating it. So make it legible, keep it clean, use straightforward language. A lot of us in every field, not just public administration or nonprofits, but we have a tendency to use the lingo that we have in our own fields. And so stay away from unnecessary complexity in the language that you're using so there can be no question about the story that you're trying to tell. People won't get lost in the jargon. They'll understand what the data actually says and what you're asking them to do with it. And so text plays a number of roles in communicating with data, whether it's labeling, whether it's introducing the data. You can have a title on something, and you can also have a subtitle. You have the title of the overall chart, and you have something right underneath it that just gives a little bit more context to what the chart actually says. Explaining, reinforcing, highlighting, but telling a story is a really important use of text in that. And then finally, we're getting again into telling the story. So don't commentate the data, describe it, tell what it actually says, not just kind of as if you're commentating a sports event. You're describing what the data actually says. In order to make your audience's brains respond as if they're inside the story, you describe what was happening, what was happening to you at the time when it happened, without necessarily adding opinions or context in that way. Make your descriptions rich. Activate that sensory cortex in your listeners by focusing on sound, on feelings in your stories. When you include emotion in your stories, your audience's mirror neurons will make them feel those emotions too. And then telling the truth in your stories is not the same as telling everything. So make sure you're editing what you're saying. This is important because I think we have a tendency sometimes to just want to say everything. We feel like if we're leaving out some data that we're obfuscating or lying by omission or something along those lines, when realistically, sometimes you have to leave some stuff out in order to really tell the story that you're trying to tell. Now, this is where it's important to have your data story be iterative and understand what really absolutely needs to be included in this in order to tell the whole story, and when a piece of data or a piece of information is superfluous. It doesn't really feed into the narrative, it doesn't really change what you're talking about, and it doesn't really add anything to the whole picture of the story that you're trying to tell. It's okay to leave that out, especially if you're trying to do something on a single slide or a single infographic and you want to have the entire story told with the smallest number of visualizations possible. That requires necessarily leaving some stuff out, and that's okay. And finally, like, don't throw in spoilers. If you're telling a story, tension is one of the key aspects of holding attention in stories. And so if you throw in spoilers, you say in the middle of a story, this is what we're going to tell you at the end, you're kind of losing that tension and you're losing that storytelling element. And so making sure if you've got a slide deck or you've got a speech or something along those lines, that it's in a sequential order that makes sense. It has a start, a middle, and an end, that you're making that ask, you're contextualizing stuff, you're bringing it all back together at the end. But if you have a big reveal in the data, if you do that first, then they're only going to be thinking about that. Really think about how you structure presentations to have an impact. And this could be done, you don't need an hour to structure a presentation like this. So it can be done in a 5-minute presentation. It can be done in a 15-minute presentation. It can be done in a 45-minute presentation, making sure it's sequentially makes sense and that it's formed in a way that tells a story and not just, here's all this stuff, now please you figure out what to do with it. So we're going to take a little bit of time and we're going to practice. And this is, so the data storytelling book that I mentioned earlier, the Cole Knaflic book, has a whole Let's Practice book that goes with it and a ton of exercises. But the one that I'm going to introduce to you now, we're going to take about 5 to 7 minutes to go through it. And I'll go through it first. But this is something that I've used with teams here at Mark, that I've used with some teams when we've done external data visualization and storytelling training with before. And it's been a really impactful and successful exercise. You can certainly make your own version of this if it makes sense to, but folks come back to this time and time again and use it on multiple projects to help them think about the context of their story. And so what we have here, it's called the Big Idea Worksheet. And so just take 5 to 7 minutes again to go through this and think about a project that you've done, maybe one that you've done recently or that you're working on now, or one that's over and you would think about doing it differently. But start with, who is your audience? Who are the primary groups or individuals that you'll be communicating to? If you had to narrow that down to a single person, who would that be? What does your audience care about and what action do they need to take? And then move forward a little bit and think about, what are the benefits if your audience acts in the way that you want them to? Is it a request for funding? Is it putting resources or people behind a particular effort? What are the risks if they don't? If they do not take the action that you're asking them to take? And then form your big idea. So in a single sentence, you should be able to articulate your point of view, convey what's at stake, and do this in a single sentence again. So taking the information that you've put together from who is the audience and what is at stake, you have that single sentence to kind of build your story from. So we're going to take a short break, about 5 minutes, use the bathroom if you need to, but also think about this project. And then what I ask is that you put in the chat the project, some basic, form your big idea, that single sentence. We don't need the whole story about, the visualization or the story that you've picked, but maybe share your single sentence in the chat, and everybody can have a chance to kind of look through those and think about their own projects. So we'll be back in just about 5 minutes. Okay, in the chat, I shared the link where all of the resources from the Storytelling with Data book are available for download. There's just a ton of stuff on that Storytelling with Data website, the Cole Knaflic group. And so that is there, and a whole bunch of other resources are there that are good exercises to use with your teams as you think about what the big idea that you're sharing is, or how to tell your story with data. So that is available in the chat. And then also, answering a question in the chat, and please continue to provide questions in the chat, and we will answer all of those either in the chat or we will address them as a larger group. So now we're going to move into a section thinking more specifically about bias. And so as we're talking about bias in data, I'm going to rely pretty heavily on the Code Academy definitions of different types of bias as we move forward. But there are, again, lots of different resources available online and in books about bias over time. Bias in data collection is not a new thing, but particularly when we are talking about programs and resources specific to economic mobility, when we're talking about sample sizes and sample collection, where we are finding our information out from. One of the big sources of information is survey collection. So making sure that our samples are set up in a way that does not over bias for certain audiences or not collect information from impacted groups. It's really important to be thoughtful and specific about how we collect data, and the data that we're using, that we understand what biases might be underlying that process or that information. So we're going to talk about a few different kinds of biases. And again, the link, this is all from Code Academy, which has a fantastic amount of resources online for this kind of information. But we're going to start with selection or sample bias, as I started with. And so this is when study subjects, i.e. the samples, so if we're just doing a community survey, are not representative of the population. And this can be due to poor study design. If the sample is too small or is not randomized, it can be hard. Community surveys are really hard to get a true statistical sample of people to respond to them. Or if you're working on something where the sample is just really small anyway, it can be biased towards the people you actually get a chance to talk to, or just the folks that actually responded. And so as humans, we have lots of biases. They can be both implicit and explicit. And biases are generally, at a high level, they're systematic errors in thinking that are influenced by cultural and personal experiences. A lot, when we talk about economic mobility data, so much of it is impacted by cultural and personal experiences. So when we're talking about transportation needs, when we're talking about home ownership and housing access, if you ask someone who has always had a roof over their heads, has never had a problem paying a mortgage, has never had they always owned a car, and therefore they think transportation is not a problem for anyone. They can have their own biases over how hard this stuff actually is. And so biases distort our perception, and they cause us to make decisions sometimes based on our own personal experiences rather than what the data actually shows us. But if the data is biased in and of itself, there was a question in the chat about sort of ethical obligations and showing the full data. Sometimes the data doesn't say what we think it will say, and knowing that is important. Understand, looking into the why. Is it because of a bias in the data set, or is it because our own personal bias? We would have expected something different based on our personal experience, and it actually is the situation, and it's just not what you would have expected based on your own cultural and personal experiences. So there's automation, but there's all kinds of different bias in selection and sample sizes when we set up surveys and different kinds of things. But when we talk about it in terms of historical bias, this is a systematic influence based on historical, social, and cultural beliefs. So when we're telling a story, we have to be open to the idea that the data doesn't tell us what we think it would have told us, and be sensitive to shaping that story around what it actually shows and not what we think it should have shown or what we think it shows. And this is really important, especially when we're in situations when we're sharing information with an audience where they themselves are reflected in the data. And this might be, like a neighborhood association or a group of people that we're telling them about a new program that we're implementing to help teach financial literacy or something along those lines. Those things are very personal to people. And when we're presenting this data back to them, they see themselves in it or they don't see themselves in it. But ultimately what we're doing is presenting information about our audience back to them. And if we in our storytelling start showing a bias of our own in the storytelling, that's going to create a lack of trust with our audience. And so making sure that we're not telling a story based on data in a way that says, oh, well, I wouldn't have expected this, but it's because of my own personal experience. Like really tell that story in a way that that does not show a bias one way or another. When we talk about bias in building and optimizing algorithms, this is especially important right now as we move into generative AI is so rapidly increasing, and I'm sure most or all of you have heard or been asked questions about how are we using ChatGPT in our work, or how can we use AI in our work. One thing to consider is that AI has been used for a long time in the background of things. AI is not new in software. AI, anytime a new assistant, if you're in a Microsoft 365 shop, you may have had Outlook pop up with these insight emails or things that say, here's when you can schedule focus time. It's using AI in the background to examine your calendar and figure out times that make sense. And there's a lot of really good uses for AI, but understanding bias in building and optimizing algorithms, especially as we move forward and using AI for more things, especially generative AI, in more things in local government, it is exceptionally important to understand what those biases are. So algorithmic biases arise when an algorithm produces systematic and repeatable errors that lead to unfair outcomes, such as privileging one group or another. This can be initiated through selection bias and then reinforced and perpetuated by other bias types. So facial recognition software is an example where algorithmic bias can do a lot of harm. One of the examples that Code Academy gives is the facial recognition software that's sold to police departments and used to recognize criminals in surveillance footage. But if the software systematically makes more mistakes based on race or gender, people in some groups will be incorrectly pursued more often. And this has serious negative outcomes for individuals. There's a project that Code Academy links to on their website called the Gender Shades Project, and it tested commercial facial recognition software for these kinds of biases. And they tested it with 3 of the big companies and assessed the accuracy of the algorithms and discovered that all of them suffered from algorithmic bias. And each software uses a proprietary algorithm and didn't report performance results with benchmarking, but this external testing really impacted the results of the system. So something else to consider is evaluation bias. And so this is testing with a non-representative data set, and that leads to evaluation bias. And so one thing to understand or know about generative AI is that it's learning from data. It has vast amounts of data, a lot from the internet that it has scraped over time, and it's learning from these data sets. But if you're using an algorithm and it's learned on a data set that is not representative of the audience, that would give you high overall accuracy scores, even if the algorithm were inaccurate for certain groups. And so the algorithms are generally proprietary on this stuff, understanding, it's a conversation that a lot of the OpenAI and Google Bard and Microsoft, that these companies are having, but they're not telling us necessarily what the algorithm is trained on. And this sort of makes them a black box. And so we don't know specifically what data was used to train and test the algorithm. And so if it's trained on inaccurate information, the results it may think they're accurate, but really they're off because of the bias that went into that algorithm development. And so as we, again, move forward into using AI and generative AI more often, it's exceptionally important to understand where the bias can be generated. And sometimes it's in the data going in, and sometimes it's in the algorithm itself, and it can exist and be exacerbated in both places. And then additional kinds of data that or biases that we're talking about. And I think this is probably one of the most common ones in the type of work in public administration in general, is the bias in interpreting results and drawing conclusions. And this is what we do all the time, right? We look at data sets. This is how we tell the story. That's what it is interpreting results, drawing conclusions, and reporting on it. So ultimately, data storytelling can be susceptible to these three kind of main types of biases as defined by the Code Academy. So we can start with confirmation bias, and that's our tendency to seek out information that supports our views. And this influences data analysis and storytelling when we consciously or unconsciously use this, interpret results in a way that supports our original hypotheses. And so if we start with clearly stating what the hypothesis is and the goals before starting an analysis, and then honestly evaluate how they influenced our interpretation, this is where it's really important to make sure that we're looking at all of the data and understanding where those anomalies are, and making sure that we're not saying, I'm going to tell a story that says this, and then finding data that supports that view. It's looking at the data and then understanding what the story is from that data. A second type of bias is just overgeneralization bias. And it's easy to do this when there's not as much data as you'd like out there. Sometimes we start a project or we start a story and you're like, it'd be so helpful if we just had this data, but that data set doesn't really exist, or it doesn't exist with a large enough sample size. And so we inappropriately extend those observations made with one data set to other data sets. And this is where we start getting into what the story actually says, or what the data actually says, and what it doesn't say. When we tend towards overgeneralization bias, that leads us to overinterpreting results and unjustified outcome or unjustified conclusions. And so in order to limit that, we need to be thoughtful when interpreting that data and understand what the limitations of specific data sets are. Maybe it's the timeline of the data. This data is only 1 year data, and we need 5 years of this to make a reasonable conclusion. Maybe it's budget information. Maybe, just understanding what the limitations are in the data that we're using is incredibly important to telling the story and being honest and truthful as we move forward, and only extend the results to the proper population, whatever that population is. And then finally, we're talking about reporting bias. And so this is that human tendency to only report or share results that affirm our beliefs or hypothesis. And so this is also known as positive results. And so to limit that, we also have to report negative results, and we have to cite others who do too. When we're doing a literature review, or we're doing something at the beginning of a project, and we find articles that say something that are different than what we were hoping to say with our story, don't leave those out just because they say something contrary to the point that we're trying to make. It's important to understand the full realm of what the data says, and if it's accredited research and all of that, and it says something completely different, that is, and you leave it out because it says something different than you're trying to tell in your data story, that's reporting bias. And so we want to make sure that we are cognizant of these biases, that we understand, as I said at the beginning, these are implicit or explicit. They can be conscious or subconscious, but understanding that these biases exist, especially these last few, confirmation, overgeneralization, reporting, these are exceptionally common and exceptionally easy to fall into. And so we as professionals need to understand that we are that trusted messenger of data when we're putting this information out, and hold ourselves responsible for understanding and overcoming, when possible, these biases exist. So one example that I wanted to bring up, and this is just the link on this slide is just to Google's store, but I noticed this a couple years ago when that Google started advertising their Pixel phone with real tone, which is how they've branded, basically making the algorithm on they're acknowledging. You can read in the text, Google's mission is to make our camera and image projects work more equitably for everyone. Historically, camera technology has excluded people of color, resulting in unflattering photos for those with darker skin tones. They're acknowledging that they spent time and energy improving their camera tuning models and algorithms to more accurately highlight diverse skin tones. And so there's 6 kind of main things that they highlight on here, and it's to recognize a broader set of faces, correctly represent skin color in pictures, make skin brightness appear more natural, reduce washed out images, sharpen images even in low light, and tune up photos. But all of this is in an effort to acknowledge that these algorithms are biased in ways that people don't even think about when they're just using their camera phone, but they're making steps toward that. So this is absolutely not a Google ad. This is not something, go out and buy this particular phone, but it's interesting that this is being used as a marketing technique for a specific phone. Like, hey, we used to do this poorly and we're spending time and effort to do this better for all of our potential customers. So that's just one example of acknowledgement of a bias and steps that they're taking toward correcting it. And this is just a quote that I particularly like from an organization that has an enterprise leaders guide. This is, you can see again, the link at the bottom to all these resources. So this is a guide to limiting bias for better data storytelling. And this quote just, it's important to recognize that biases exist naturally. And in fact, it's nearly impossible to eliminate biases altogether when working with mass volumes of data. And most organizations would readily recognize that they're sometimes making ineffective decisions because of inaccurate or incomplete data. But it's important to recognize that people hold biases, that algorithms hold biases, that data hold biases, and all of these things exist. And it's important to remember that data is hardly 100% objective. And so it's humans who give meaning to these figures. It's humans who are drawing the conclusions. It's humans who are defining the meaning through our own personal interpretations and our storytelling and our cultural experiences. And so it's up to each of us, each as individuals, to be better, to understand, to acknowledge, and better understand the ways that our own personal biases affect our perceptions, and take that active role in limiting the effects of cognitive bias as we're in our interpretation, in our understanding, in our reporting of critical data. And so some examples of that sort of humanizing of data, or really telling stories with data, come in. Here's a couple examples specific to kind of economic mobility data. So here's an example from Pew Trust. So they have a project called Faces of Economic Mobility. And this is the front page of that. And so if you didn't have this image of people on the front, it might feel less personal. It might feel less human. This is an exploratory page. You can see across the top, it says select your profile, and you start selecting kind of buckets of data, and it'll give you information from there. But what they're doing up front is telling you the story of this project, of what the data says, starting with overall findings, but in a narrative form, but also welcoming the reader in. It starts with welcome to the faces of economic mobility, humanizing the information by showing essentially personas of people, because obviously these are drawings, they could be digital versions of actual people, but it's showing the face of the people and acknowledging that what we're talking about with economic mobility data are people. So these are the faces of that data. It's not just data points that have been generated by something. This is information about people's individual life situations. And so starting the website, having this be the homepage of it, really starts off on the right foot and humanizes the data and gives the viewer the option of choosing their own adventure with the data, with the drop downs. But it says, hey, this data is about people. Next, we have a lot of you have heard about opportunity insights and all of the work that that Chetty's group has done on this, or Raj Chetty's group has done. But one of the things that is really important here is how do you tell the story of that data without asking everybody to come to you? And so one thing that they've done an exceptionally good job at is telling the story through other platforms. And so this is an article from International Monetary Fund on their page. We've got another story that are takeaways from Brookings, and that's on Brookings' page. Another story that is from the Harvard Gazette. So working through other trusted messengers to tell the story that you're trying to tell is not always a bad approach. It can get your story out in other platforms. And so when we think about this on a local level, are we talking about the local newspaper? Are we talking about TV stations? Are we talking about other agencies? It's not always your website and your first person that is the only place that you can tell the story that you're trying to tell. So thinking about other ways to share the story that you're trying to tell and other messengers to tell it through. It's still, all of these give a credit to Raj's team and the Opportunity Insights team, which is a fantastic website, by the way. If you scroll through it, we gave some examples on last week's data visualization webinar, but figuring out where else you can tell your story and who else might be a good messenger for that message is also part of that storytelling process. So I want to share a video and this is just a piece of a TED Talk, and this TED Talk is worth going out and finding more or watching the rest of this. But I'm going to share this one just briefly, just a few minutes of this to kind of bring everything together that we've talked about.
Having that activity. As you listen to stories, you automatically gain empathy for the storyteller. The more empathy you experience, the more oxytocin is released in your brain. Oxytocin is the feel-good chemical, and the more oxytocin you have, the more trustworthy you actually view the speaker. This is why storytelling is such a critical skill for a leader, because the very act of telling a story makes people trust you more. As you begin to listen to data, some different things happen. There are some misconceptions to understand. And the first is that data doesn't change our behavior, emotions do. If data changed our behavior, we would all sleep 8 hours and exercise and floss daily and drink 8 glasses of water, but that's not how we actually decide. Neuroscientists have studied decision-making, and it starts in our amygdala. This is our emotional epicenter where we have the ability to experience emotions, and it's here at a subconscious level where we begin to decide. We make choices to pursue pleasure or to avoid risk, all before we become aware of it. At the point we become aware, where it comes to the conscious level, we start to apply rationalization and logic, which is why we think we're making these rationally based decisions, not realizing that they were already decided in our subconscious. Antonio Damasio is a neuroscientist that started to study patients that had damage to their amygdala, fully functioning in every way except they could not experience emotions. And as a result, they could not make decisions. Something as simple as, do I go this way or this way? They were incapable of doing because they could not experience emotions. These were people that were wildly successful before they had the damage to their amygdala, and now they couldn't complete any of their projects, and their careers took big hits, all because they couldn't experience emotions where we decide. Another data misconception. Data never speaks for itself. Our brains love to anticipate, and as we anticipate, we fill in the gaps on what we're seeing or hearing with our own knowledge and experience and our own bias, which means my understanding of data is going to differ from yours, and it's going to differ from yours because we're all going to have our own interpretation if there isn't a way to guide us through. Now, I'm not suggesting that data's bad and story's good. They both play a key role. And to understand how, you have to see what makes a great story. It's going to answer 3 questions. The first is, what is the context? Meaning, what's the setting? Who's involved? Why should I even care? What is the conflict? Where's that moment where everything changes? And what is the outcome? Where is it different? What is the takeaway? A good story also has 3 attributes. The first being it is going to build and release tension. So because our brains love to anticipate, a great story builds tension by making you wonder, where is she going with this? What's happening next? Right? A good story keeps your attention going. And it releases it by sharing something unexpected. And it does this over and over throughout the story. A great story also builds an idea. It helps you see something that you can no longer unsee, leaving you changed, because stories actually do leave you changed. And a great story communicates value. Stanford has done research on one of the best ways to shape organizational culture, and it is storytelling, because it's going to demonstrate what you value and encourage, or what you don't value and what you discourage. As you start to write your power.
Okay, so there's plenty more where that came from on that particular TED Talk, but it's a fantastic sort of end to bringing everything together and why this is important. And that is actually the end of the content for today. And so I am happy to answer questions or provide any further comments or feedback. And I will toss it back to Anna to kind of take us through the rest of the session.
Thank you, Amanda. Like Amanda said, we have the Q&A and the chat open for any questions that you might have. We're going to stick around for a couple minutes if anything pops in your brain. But I do have one initial question for you, Amanda, just to get us kicked off. What advice would you give to a manager or anyone in any kind of local government that is using all the techniques that you use today, but they're still having difficulty getting their story across to their council or their board? What's like the top things that they should be looking at to make sure that they're really communicating the correct story?
So I think one thing that we can fall into fairly often is when you are super passionate about a project with which a lot of public administration folks are passionate about what they're working on. You know, they understand that what we're working on is for the greater good and it's going to help people, and, you know, and it can be hard to not push forward with your own personal feelings on why it's important or what, and acknowledging that every audience is not there for the same reasons. And so maybe you're talking about your data in a way that assumes something about the audience, assumes what their intrinsic motivation is, you know, and so that comes back to maybe start at step 1 again and understand your audience, know what each of those council people is about, why they ran for office, why they're there what's important to them. And so, so for an example, several years ago, we were working in Kansas City. I was part of a sort of young professionals advisory group. And we were working on the city's open data policy. And it was the first time they would have an open data policy. This was 10 plus years ago. And we're talking about why it's important for transparency in data. And before each meeting that we had with a council person, and this was in my capacity as a resident of the city, not, you know, this wasn't Mark going out and doing this, but we met this group of young professionals met with each council person before the vote to understand what are their concerns with it, what, you know, and it was really eye-opening to understand. Some were concerned more about, you know, how you might be able to find business permits through it. And some were really concerned about the data privacy elements of it. And some were really, you know, so even within the same audience, you can have different motivations for things. You can't anticipate all of those ahead of time. You can't go meet with every council person before every presentation. Like, it's just not feasible to do it that way. But spending more time than you think you need understanding your audience will make the presentation, the influence, the action item that, you know, the action you're asking them to take, it will make it that much more impactful if you're really spending more meaningful time on that particular step.
Great, thank you. Well, it doesn't look like any questions have come through. Amanda, do you have any closing thoughts that you want to leave us with?
I think the only thing, just to kind of tack on to your question and take it forward another step, is, you know, the video that we watched at the tail end talked about emotions and people, you know, you make decisions before you've even realized that you've made them. And we talked a little bit about being really passionate about what you're doing and why it is. And if you can effectively marry that data storytelling with that passion that you have for your topic, you will bring people along with you. That will be infectious to them. They will understand like, wow, this person really cares about what they're talking about, and it was backed up by data. So just carrying that forward, this data storytelling is not about losing that individual passion for it and, showing chart after chart and telling your story like that. It is really about marrying those two things together to really impact and influence and ask for action from your audience.
Well, thank you, Amanda. I've really enjoyed this presentation. And again, thank you for bringing this to us today. And we thank you for your time. Thank you to everyone for joining us. If you have any questions, Amanda's information is right there on the screen. And if you have any other questions regarding the Economic Mobility and Opportunity Initiative that we have going on right now with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, please feel free to visit our webpage at icma.org/EMO. Thank you again for coming today. And Julian, I will kick it off to you.
And with that, we must conclude today's webinar. A special thank you to our presenter and to everyone who joined us today, and we hope we will see you again soon. Please take a moment to complete a brief evaluation of today's program by returning to the ICMA Learning Lab page where you logged in today. The survey must be completed to unlock your certificate for this program. After completing the survey, you can access your certificate via the Achievements tab at the top of the interface. A recording of today's session will be uploaded to the same place you found the Zoom link in the Learning Lab. Today's program is copyright 2023 by the International City-County Management Association with all rights reserved. This concludes today's program. You may now disconnect or remain for another few minutes if you have any last-minute questions.